You say there's a 20-year slumber on taxation reform in this submission. Why is the taxation system in a deep sleep, so to speak?
Yeah, well, it's time to rethink. We've had federal government raising revenue, you've had state governments raising revenue, and now there's almost a competition to see who can raise the biggest revenue out of business. What we're saying now is if you keep taxing business, we'll lose business. There are opportunities in other countries, and we're seeing that. There are other opportunities in other states, and we're seeing that as well. So Victoria, to remain competitive, we need to see a better outcome for Victorian business. And our view right now is let's drop the borders across the states and let's have a rethink about where we want business to play in the overall Australian economy, and selfishly from the Victorian side, how do we incentivise Victorian business to get that growth and stimulus going again.
Drop the borders, eh? Time to rethink some federation issues.
Yeah, we kind of lost that a little bit through COVID, and you know, there's some big challenges ahead for Australia, big challenges ahead for Victoria. We can't operate in isolation to the rest of the country.
So in your submission, you're actually proposing some new incentives for states. When we take Victoria, it's the state with the biggest debt profile of any of the states around the country. Now, there's levies such as the COVID levy, which is on business payrolls, mental health levy on business payrolls. What's your idea to try and reduce that?
Yeah, so no other state had these levies. You know, the COVID one was brought about because of the debt that was born through COVID. Park that's happened, business shouldn't have to pay that off. And what we're saying is, while that COVID debt levy sits there, business in this state is less competitive. So we're simply saying to the federal government, if the state government here is willing to drop that COVID debt levy on Victorian business, can there be a payment coming in from the federal government to say, we'll cover that debt, pay it back over time, but we don't want you to pass that on to business. In some ways, it's talking to productivity. Because the more we tax business, the less productive they're going to be, because they can't make the profit that they need to be. So it can be the start of a stimulus in terms of let's look at the overall taxation system. The Victorian government started looking at it through the stamp duty reforms, which is a great initiative, particularly on industrial commercial properties. What else can we do from a payroll tax side? What else can we do from other revenue raising perspectives? And what we're saying is let's start with this COVID debt so that businesses in Victoria don't wear that impost.
Do you support them looking at stamp duty for residentials too? I mean, obviously that's not a thing completely tied to business, but it might help the market.
Yeah, we think it gets down to the portability of people, and we know in a housing crisis, the more we can do to free up housing, so that's people moving out of their current property into another property, will make it easier for people to move if that stamp duty impost isn't there. But the state can't do it without support from the federal government. So again, it's an opportunity to say we want to do this taxation reform, but we need some support from the federal government to help us bankroll that in the period when we're not going to get that revenue coming in.
You're saying there should be a bonus payment out of the federal government. That's something that we haven't seen before for states achieving, you know, reducing levies and whatnot. How would that practically work?
Well, it's as I said before, and if you look at the GST side, there's a carve up of GST, and we won't get into it now, but it's not uniform. So what we're saying is, how do we look at the taxation system that each state has to make it more uniform across the states? How do we incentivise business across the state? And then we're going to have the same conversation when it comes to energy, right? Victoria or New South Wales or Queensland shouldn't be penalised because of the energy resources they have or don't have. How do we get to a point where the whole energy debate is centred around the eastern seaboard and pick South Australia up in that? So it doesn't matter where the energy comes from. We all get the benefit from it.
So what do you make of nuclear? Is that part of the conversation in the future?
I think everything should be part of the conversation, but I think we have to have some practicalities around it. If we're going to get to net zero by 2035, and that's what the state's after, nuclear doesn't probably play for 2 decades down the track. So in time, it may come in, but where we're confronted now, it's around solar, it's around offshore wind. I think we should be looking at technologies like extracting hydrogen and ammonia out of coal. They're technologies at work now. Let's deal with what we can to get us to the point where the gas reserves, if there aren't any more, how do we get liquid natural gas in, or how do we bring more down from Queensland? But how do we use the other resources, which we know, particularly hydrogen from coal, to stand up where we're going to be with wind. We know that coal power generators are going to come out of, or they're going to be at end of life before too long. What replaces those? Let's concern ourselves with what we can do rather than the philosophical conversation.
And part of that too is there was a big energy event earlier in the year in Victoria where 500,000 homes were off, or businesses. Is it that reliability piece too that needs to be part of the federal budget?
Absolutely. It's the affordability and reliability of energy, and that's both electricity and gas, because we know we can't transition without gas. We know there's plenty of reserves in Queensland, not so in New South Wales and not so in Victoria. Now, we may choose to explore for more, and that's certainly an option that needs to be on the table. We may import more into Victoria through the liquid natural gas, particularly out of the Geelong harbour there.
Yeah.
Or we may increase the pipe size coming down from Queensland, which already exists.
You've got 20 recommendations to Jim Chalmers. In your report, do you talk at all about infrastructure, particularly for Victoria? Say, for instance, should there be more federal money for suburban rail loop, airport rail, whatnot?
What we'd say is let's get agreement between federal government and state government around what the priorities for infrastructure are going to be. We know we're going to get population growth through migration in this country, and Victoria takes its fair share. You can't have increased population without infrastructure spend and build to match that. Otherwise the state becomes unlivable. What we'd love to see is a 10-year rollout in terms of a plan on where the money is going to be, and make that a 10-year rolling plan which gets support from both opposition and government, so it no longer becomes contestable at state elections, and then get the funding from the federal government to roll in behind that. Then that takes the argument out of it.
Because that would go beyond the federal budget's estimates, which are usually 4 years.
Totally. But it gives certainty.
And minerals too in Victoria. I mean, WA, Queensland, vast with minerals. The federal budget, you say, should look at rare earths in Victoria?
Yeah, we do. And if you look at Victoria's history, the gold rush meant so much to the development of our state. We've got the largest ballroom of any in government houses around the world, including Buckingham Palace, Melbourne Town Hall, exhibition buildings. Were all built out of that gold rush era. In many ways, we're coming back to it. Now, I'm not talking about bulldozers and graders everywhere. I'm talking about it in a managed sense, but to get those rare earth minerals in a way that they can work for the state in terms of, putting money into the state's coffers, which would be good, but importantly, providing important minerals so that the rest of development can occur. And when you look at cars, when you look at technology, they're moving more into that rare earth components to be able to manufacture those.
Paul Guerra, thanks for joining Sky News.
Pleasure. Thanks, Simon.